what we intend to do here is to bring you through what we see as the project, and then to talk, before the end, to talk about two community applications of MBSs.
In case you're trying to figure out, this is Liam, this is Sean. And don't panic, I know we have the graveyard shift before lunch, but what we'll try and do is tie together all of the speakers and the themes, and maybe give a little bit of a background, and then at the end talk a little bit about the overseas work, which is going to feed into this whole concept of community development.
So, I suppose, to start, we did this yesterday, and it's the idea of resilient cities. And why are we talking about resilient cities? We're talking about it because of vulnerability, and it comes from the Latin vulnus, susceptible to being damaged or harmed. And that weakness can be climate change, infrastructure, or population or food supply.
And the picture you're looking at there is Freetown in Sierra Leone, where I lived for a couple of years, which is what this project is a little bit about. Inadequate planning, inadequate infrastructure, an inherently vulnerable city. And unfortunately, that vulnerability was truly exposed in 2015 when there was a landslide, or series of landslides, that killed upwards of 1,000 people. So this vulnerability of a city is one of the core aspects. It's the first point we want to talk about.
And then we like to talk about resilience. Resilience, again, is Latin resilio. It's to cope with destabilizing forces. And resilient cities are designed to cope with disturbance and destabilization, and to absorb these events and continue as near to possible as normal. So this is, here in front of you, is Philadelphia, where they have introduced a Green City clean water project for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
And we also talk about diversity, again from the Latin diverse, various or different ways. And we also talk about hybrid infrastructure, this mixture of grey and green infrastructure. And that increases resilience and reduces vulnerability.
And that brings us to the S word, all things to all people everywhere, sustainability. And really, it brings the points together. It's the well-being of the natural world and the responsible use of resources. In essence, what we're talking about is reducing vulnerability and increasing resilience, and increasing diversity. So those three themes, which Joanne, Victor and Albert and Declan, this nature-based solutions, these hybrid infrastructure, it really comes together in that concept for a community to try to achieve those 3 points, which for us is sustainability.
If we were to put it in a slogan, it would be moving from shock, and here you can see the shock of, it's in an earthquake zone, and they've been obliterated. So we're moving from shock to stress. And here you can see a community, they know what the dangers are there, and they're building in such a way as to cope with the shock, so that the shock becomes a stress. It's something that they can absorb. So in order to do this, you have to act differently, think differently, and interact differently. And that's where we get into the nature-based solutions. So what are nature-based solutions? They're both natural and constructed systems, and they utilize physical, chemical and biological treatment processes. And these processes form the scientific and engineering principles for water, wastewater treatment, hydraulic infrastructure. They can be low cost, they can be low energy, but they provide what we like to talk about as an added value through ecosystem services. And these ecosystem services are the benefits that accrue to us as humans through, can be climate change, it can be water or wastewater treatment, resource recovery and reuse, and restoration of degraded ecosystems.
So I suppose the funders of today and this process, we would see this as a process which we'll chat to you about in the afternoon, is Build Solid Ground, which is a programme funded by the European Union, and it has 14 organisations, and DIT and Engineers Without Borders are the two technical leads in Ireland, and then there are a number of Habitat for Humanity partners. But the core of it is 3 simple things. The first thing is awareness, is exactly what we're talking about today, making people aware that there are different alternatives, and the second part of it is capacity. So in other words, building the capacity through toolkits, and we'll talk a little bit about the start of the toolkit that we're going to use in the afternoon. And then the third strand of it is opportunities to actually engage, whether that's at home in Ireland or whether that's overseas in some of the developing country partners. So they're the three kind of pillars of where we are. And DIT are involved in the hybrid infrastructure, nature-based solutions, resilience, vulnerability. And the core of it is, again, back to the S word, can't avoid it, the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. If anyone knows or understands them, I'd like to talk to you later. I'm still trying to figure them out. But SDG 11, which in essence for us is a community or a city that's safe, resilient, sustainable. These concepts of building in resilience through diversity and reducing the inherent vulnerability. And I won't go through it there, but that's the core of this EU project, which is about working with communities, professionals, planners, citizens to engage in, for their particular locality, how to actually integrate these new solutions. So I suppose, and it's a little bit timely, we were talking to John Burton earlier about yesterday's budget and climate change and what's in it for climate change. And I suppose we've used this slide quite a lot, and really we're at the point where if we're serious, we being collective we do have to think differently and we have to act differently. I'm a civil engineer, Sean's a scientist, and when I was working in practice we would be building large-scale infrastructure, and you do an environmental impact assessment, which you superimpose the infrastructure on the environment. We call it building in nature. And the themes this morning from Victor, Albert and Joanne is thinking from the start that you have a natural system and starting to build nature in. Like Victor had a very good example from the Dutch experience, that if you think differently from the start, then you end up at a very different endpoint. And that really takes leadership, which we can debate in the afternoon whether it's there or not. But that's what we call act differently.
And then the other important thing is to think differently. And the big change here is that we see resources. We see everything as a resource. What I said yesterday about how does a butcher look at a chicken? The butcher looks at a chicken as what can I get off this animal?
Apologies to the vegetarians in the audience.
So what we would be saying is, what resources are in this? What is looked on before as waste? Is there heat in it? Are there nutrients in it? So that's a big move. And of course, what we're going to talk about now is moving from not the top down, which we're very good at here in Ireland. It's one way of looking at it, and it's my way of looking at it. We're trying to move from bottom up to get that awful word, stakeholders, more involved. So this first case study we have here is from Bolivia, and it's of, do you want to explain that bit?
Yeah, I suppose one of our partners that we worked with and travelled over to meet, Bolivia. Why Bolivia? Well, Bolivia actually has been successful in integrating rural water, and you can see there the graph, that's supply. And it's do-it-yourself. It's this whole sustainability and resilience and vulnerability at community level, not necessarily from top down, at community level where the community has the solution. This is Wolfgang Eli Buchner, completely bonkers but completely brilliant in equal measure. And his philosophy is quite simple, is that the technologies developed in Bolivia or in developing countries have to be as efficient as something you would buy off the shelf in Ireland. The difference is, it has to be maintained locally. It has to use local parts, local skills. So what you're looking at there is what he calls EMAS pumps. He has a training centre and trains local technicians in these technologies. Those technicians then install, and they only graduate when they have installed the technology in the locality.
Interestingly, the people who have to attend have to pay. It's not a freebie. And they spend 30 days learning how to build a range of technologies. They go back to their own village, they install them, and he's creating an economy. So here we can see he has kind of what he calls a village technology centre, where the locals can come in, do the course. It's tactile, you take the stuff apart, you put it together again, you build them up. And then this bottom slide here is a guy in his own home. And you can see there's rainwater harvesting, a tank that he installed himself and made himself. There's a larger tank for showers and for, they're the tanks. And here you've got a shower and tanks up here on the right with solar panels. So at 12,000 feet in Bolivia, you can have a hot water shower.
And it's an interesting, we came across him in Sierra Leone and we travelled to Bolivia to work with him. But his philosophy is quite simple. It's not a poor person's product. It's a pretty high-tech product, just using local, you've got beer bottles, you've got glycerin, and this is a solar shower that's installed in local campesinos, but also in houses in La Paz. And this is a solar water heater for a school. So the technology is not the challenge. It's providing added value to the community. And again, you see here the local resource centre and the kind of technologies. And if you can train two cholos from DIT to make pumps in a day, you can train anyone. This is using local resources. I worked quite a lot in Africa, and the curse of pumps not working right across developing world. This is the technologies that are there, quite sophisticated technologies, but using local resources in what's called a village technology resource centre.
But the big point is that he has built in to this system a failure. If you think about a lot of the high-end or high-cost development programs, when the engineer who installed it goes away and the pump breaks down or whatever other part breaks down, there's not the knowledge there to put it back together. Here in the design, he builds in the fact that it's going to fail. And here we are out we at a family, the same family you saw earlier, and he's having the owner, the campesino, is having problems with a washer. And he's putting in and repairing the problem that he had. So the maintenance is built in because of a built-in failure.
Yeah, and I suppose it's this concept of vulnerability and resilience, again, at a very practical level, where you've got pretty much year-round supply of water, a shower, all within the upkeep of the local user.
This is a village wash facility. So the women would come, and it's mainly women, would come down and do the washing down at this wash house. But there's also a pump that pumps it back up to the village about 500 metres away.
So I suppose some of the things that start to come together, and we'll talk in the afternoon, is that both in developing countries and in Ireland, we would say the community is not the consumer or customer, which is the traditional role where engineers present a solution. Actually, the community is the design team, the finance team, the operation and the maintenance team to be truly sustainable.
And that's a huge flip. That's you're talking about acting and thinking differently. That flip to seeing the community as a design team, to seeing them as having the resources. It's this community participatory approach. That's a big flip. The next one here, this is the Isle of Egg in Scotland. And they became famous because they were owned, it was privately owned, and they eventually got together and bought the island. I think an ex-Beatle may have helped them out. They don't know, but some donor gave them a huge amount of money to actually buy the island for themselves. So they bought the island for themselves, and they had no electricity. So there's about, 100 people on the island?
Yeah.
So they got together, and they built their own grid. And they built their own grid with hydro, solar, and wind.
Yeah, and I suppose there's maybe a question earlier about what's the drivers. Well, the driver here was necessity. The island didn't have a connection to the grid. They were using diesel generators and the cost, etc. And from the community empowerment through buying out the island, they developed this project. And also, the north of the island is hydro, the southwest is wind, and then they have solar. And they were told at the start that it wasn't possible to have an integrated grid. They could have two grids, one hydro and the south. But the community themselves said no, because inevitably what will happen is there'll be conflict. Part of the island will have power, the other part won't. So they held out, and the solution was developed where it's an integrated system, an integrated electric grid. This is the solar part of it.
It's interesting about the solar because it's more northerly. They're more northerly than Derry. So one would tend to think that the solar wouldn't be that efficient, but they put in 10 kilowatts first, and they very quickly, within about 6 months to 8 months, realised that they could do with 20 kilowatts more again, and they found the solar very efficient. This is the wind, and yeah.
These actually are windmills that were decommissioned from Germany, that were purchased by the islanders and are now providing, I think, maybe about 30–40% of the island's power. And this is the hydro component.
So there's your head coming down, and where Liam is walking there at the bottom, the house with the red roof, I think, is where the yeah.
So I suppose, and these are the storage panels. But the interesting part is that this is community being designer, finance, operation, maintenance. What you've got here is you've got the green light, red light, and basically green light means we have power. Okay, you can boil your kettle, you can put on your washing machine. Red light means we have to limit our power. So the community know when the traffic light is on, red, that they have to conserve, because all of them are dependent, and they still have a little bit of dependency on.
They're about 95%, 90 to 95% supplied by the grid. They have about 5% of diesel, but they were working on various other ways.
The traffic lights are on the local pub, in case you're wondering where.
Yeah, where else? So what we're trying to do with today is, and with the project, is put together a toolkit of nature-based solutions. And that's what we handed you out here. We're moving towards it, and there's a bit of work. And also at the back, to kind of promote the workshop in the second half of the day, we have a methodology. And these are the 5 points from the methodology. And the methodology, and it's in our handout there. The first thing we would suggest doing is getting together and identifying the project location, but delineating it and marking it as a set with a boundary. And that would have to be done, obviously, with the community. Also with the community, as you'll see from some of the work we have in the afternoon that Pat has brought into us, Pat Kennedy, is you have to analyse or identify existing assets and also existing deficits. And some of these deficits can be physical, some of them can be technological, some can be knowledge-based. After that, we would suggest looking at appropriate NBS solutions, and that's what this toolkit is for, is to identify a range of them. We haven't had SUDS in here because we felt that SUDS was quite well known. We went for less well known ones. And then
the last part is to analyse and to identify constraints and risks, and the output really will be a proposal. So in the afternoon, we'll split into a couple of groups. Each of the speakers will lead one of the workshops, and we'll hopefully create a few arguments en route. And I suppose the last thing to leave you with is we would see this as the start of a process. This EU project is a 3-year project, and the start of a process and the start of an engagement. And ideally building together a practical-based toolkit that can be used by planners, professionals, community, etc. With the 3 points there is to create sustainable communities. How? By reducing vulnerability, increasing resilience, and increasing diversity. And
part of the change in thinking is what we said already about viewing waste as a resource, but also designing water in rather than designing water out. If somebody is putting up a housing development, they start thinking of putting the water off-site. And what we would be pushing is to bring the water on-site and to include it in the design. So there's a long way to go, folks. I think everybody knows that, but I think hopefully we've kicked it off today anyway, not before.
Yeah. If you're wondering about the picture is what Dublin will look like after the next election.
Yeah, I think.
So thanks very much for your attention, and look forward to chatting in the afternoon.